Alright everyone, tonight we're diving into something that threatened the very fabric of medieval society. Picture this: a lone genius, likely with zero social life, deciding to slap a price tag on things that had been free since forever. So, before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely dig what I'm doing here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always fascinated by the global audience. Before medieval Europe gave us taxes, tolls, and profound emotional trauma, there was the communal bread oven, a truly wholesome institution that peasants could actually depend on. The concept was simple. You brought your slightly sad lump of dough, someone else brought their even sadder dough, and everyone baked together in a structure that somehow looked older than time itself. No fees, no rules, no lord breathing down your neck. Just peasants, soot, and a glimmer of hope hanging in the air. And then disaster struck. One morning, the local lord awoke, deeply disturbed, having sensed joy lurking somewhere within his territory. A peasant laughing? Someone whistling? A woman actually feeling content? Unacceptable. That kind of behavior is contagious. So he stormed into the village square, glared at the oven as if it owed him back rent, and declared, "This is mine now. You want bread? Pay up." Imagine being a starving farmer in 1140 AD, clutching your dough, listening to a guy who's never touched flour in his life explain that heat is now a luxury. The peasants stared at him blankly, like chickens watching someone assemble a trebuchet. "But my lord," someone whispered, "the oven belongs to the community." The lord, a man who probably thought grain grew in pre-packaged bags, simply smiled and said, "Not anymore." Suddenly, baking became a premium experience. No coin, no bread. No bread, well, congratulations, you've unlocked medieval intermittent fasting permanently. But the Baron, a man who believed the earth itself answered to his boots, simply replied, "It is free for me." His smile did not reach his eyes, possibly because his eyes had never expressed warmth before. Soon poor families were spending half their income just to let their animals eat. The irony was staggering. The peasants fed the animals fed the lord's taxes, and the lords fed on the satisfaction of turning sunshine, soil, and chlorophyll into a revenue stream. A few rebellious peasants tried sneaking their animals onto common land at night. These moonlit missions looked like undercover heists, except the treasure was grass, and the thieves were exhausted sheep. In the end, medieval grass became one of the most profitable inventions of the Middle Ages. Not because it changed, but because someone woke up, looked at a meadow, and shouted the most dangerous word in feudal Europe: mine. If there was one thing medieval peasants depended on more than hope or prayer, it was beer. Not because they loved the taste, medieval beer tasted like anxiety and wet hay, but because water could kill you faster than an invading army. Beer was liquid safety, hydration with training wheels. Beer was the only beverage a medieval villager could drink without contemplating their imminent funeral. Naturally, this meant the authorities had to ruin it. Home brewing was once a simple, communal ritual. Every household crafted its own weak, cloudy brew using barley, whatever herbs were nearby, and sometimes ingredients that should never have entered a liquid meant for human consumption. But it was theirs, and it was free. Then, one day, a town councilman whose personality resembled stale bread realized something horrifying. People were enjoying beer without paying him. This discovery triggered an intense emotional crisis, the kind nobles felt when peasants smiled too long. The legion was originally crafted under Julius Caesar, a man who loved two things above all: glory and legions that made him look unstoppable. If Caesar gave a unit his personal approval, that meant it was ruthless, disciplined, and dangerously efficient. Legio X quickly became one of his favorites, and being Caesar's favorite came with perks like better pay, better camp positions, and a reputation that made enemies tremble. But it also came with responsibilities, such as winning battles that no sane commander should have asked humans to fight. Early on, the men of Legio X earned their name in the naval theater of the civil wars. It wasn't common for Roman legions to fight at sea, but Caesar did not care. If he needed infantrymen to sprint across the deck of a ship during a storm and hack apart Pompeian sailors, he expected Legio X to smile, salute, and do it. They did exactly that. Their identity, half soldier, half sea beast, began there, carved into their pride as deeply as into their shields. They were also known for a symbol that captured their character perfectly. The wild boar. Not a noble eagle, not a mythic creature, no, a boar. The kind of animal that charges headfirst into danger, refuses to die cleanly, and leaves scars on anyone foolish enough to corner it. The men of Legio X liked this symbolism. It matched their nature. Stubborn, fearless, and always ready to smash through anything keeping them from their objective. By the time the first century of the Empire rolled in, Legio X had already built a reputation as one of Rome's most aggressive and reliable legions. Loyal to a fault, brutal when ordered, and impossible to intimidate. They marched wherever the emperors pointed, toward deserts, mountains, and, in time, the explosive province of Judea, where their legend would solidify forever. But their duties weren't limited to policing. They remained a military unit first and foremost, trained to respond to larger threats. When the sparks of the Bar Kokhba revolt began decades later, Legio X was still there, its veterans scarred and relentless, its recruits raised in the shadow of Jerusalem's ashes. The new rebellion would be one of the fiercest Rome had ever faced, and Legio X would once again be at the center of the fight. For now, though, the region simmered in uneasy submission. Markets reopened, caravans returned, and Rome began reshaping the province in its own image. But the people never forgot what had happened or who had done it. Legio X had become more than a legion. It was an occupying force, a warning, a symbol etched into the land itself. Their work in Judea was not ending. It was evolving. By the time Legio X finally left its long station in Judea, generations had passed. New emperors had risen and fallen. Cities elsewhere had flourished, crumbled, and been rebuilt again. But in Judea, the shadow of the legion remained heavy, even after its boots were no longer on the ground. Few legions in Roman history shaped a region so profoundly and so violently as Legio X. Their role in crushing the Great Revolt had already etched their name into memory. But what came after made their legacy even harder to erase. They became the instruments through which Rome reshaped Judea into something unrecognizable. The temple's ruin, the construction of garrisons, the redrawing of borders, the new taxes and new laws, all of it unfolded under the watchful eyes of the boar-emblazoned legionaries. For many locals, Legio X was not simply an enemy. It was the face of Rome itself. Their ruthlessness during the Bar Kokhba revolt decades later only deepened that impression. The uprising was fierce, organized, and more widespread than the first rebellion. Judean fighters built underground networks, fortified caves, and disciplined units. Having been burned down, the guild invariably rebuilt it. Should a member pass away, the guild ensured his burial was paid for. If an apprentice was orphaned, the guild stepped in to act as a surrogate guardian. Medieval society largely lacked formalized social services, but guilds generously filled that void. Their halls, frequently impressive structures of timber or stone, were more than just meeting places. They were political hubs, archives, banquet venues, and even courts of law. Disputes were settled within those walls, bypassing city authorities. Masters adjudicated conflicts among members, fines were levied, oaths were sworn, and decisions were handed down. The hall stood as a symbol of unity, authority, and the enduring nature of the craft. Parades and processions further solidified the guild's presence. On feast days, guild members marched through town in their finest attire, banners waving, tools polished to a shine, chests puffed out with pride. This was more than simple pride. It served as advertisement, political theater, and a clear reminder to onlookers that this particular craft was both honored and possessed significant power. The medieval guild wasn't merely a workplace. It was a brotherhood, a church, a social club, a welfare system, and a political faction all rolled into one. And this very unity would soon lay the groundwork for conflicts far exceeding mere squabbles over bread or boots. As guilds accrued authority, they inevitably clashed with another rising force within medieval towns, the merchant class. If the craftsmen represented the city's hands, the merchants were its lifeblood. facilitating the movement of goods, money, and influence across Europe. For a time, both groups enjoyed a mutually beneficial relationship. Guilds depended on merchants to distribute their products, while merchants relied on guilds to guarantee quality. Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son, was a figure of immense popularity and promise. Beloved by the Janissaries, respected throughout the provinces, and admired even by foreign ambassadors, he possessed a rare charisma, notable military talent, and was widely expected to inherit the Ottoman throne. To the empire, he seemed the ideal successor. However, to Hurrem, Mustafa represented an existential threat, a barrier to her own son's ambitions. Should he ascend to the throne, her sons would inevitably be eliminated, a consequence of the brutal yet entrenched rules of Ottoman succession. Hurrem could not ignore this stark reality, nor could her closest political confidant Rustam Pasha, her son-in-law and the Grand Vizier. Together, they forged a strategic alliance that would dramatically reshape the future of the empire. Subtle yet devastating rumors began to circulate, whispers that hinted at Mustafa's alleged rebellion, his clandestine correspondence with enemies of the empire, and his excessive popularity within the army. In an empire where succession plots were not unusual but rather expected, these rumors, though insidious, resonated with a degree of plausibility. Whether Hurrem herself initiated these rumors or merely amplified existing fears, they succeeded in eroding Suleiman's trust in Mustafa. The Sultan, weary from decades of war and personal grief, grew increasingly anxious about potential betrayal. Memories of past palace coups haunted him, and the notion of a rebellious prince no longer seemed unthinkable, but rather a historically recurring pattern. The decisive moment arrived in 1553. As Suleiman marched to quell a revolt in Persia, Mustafa, intending to demonstrate his loyalty and confidence, rode to join the campaign. Instead of a welcoming embrace, he was met with accusations and suspicion rather than paternal affection. Summoned to his father's tent, Mustafa entered alone, unaware of the executioners concealed behind a curtain. Some rebels tried baking at home, but medieval homes were basically flammable suggestions. One spark and the whole neighborhood went up in flames, like it was auditioning to be Mordor. So even trying to be self-sufficient became a high-stakes arson speedrun. The Lord, of course, exploited the situation. If the oven burned your bread, fee. If you burned the oven, bigger fee. If you complained, insult fee. If you breathed too loudly while waiting in line, an unspecified fee that changed daily. What was once a simple town gathering became a medieval DMV. Long lines, glacial service, and one guy in charge who clearly hated everyone. The peasants adapted in the only way they knew how, quiet resentment and muttering insults under their breath, like, "May a goat sneeze on his stew, and may his boots be forever wet." But deep down, they knew the truth. This was just the beginning. If a lord could charge for baking, he could charge for anything: walking, existing, looking at birds the wrong way. Medieval Europe had entered its villain arc. Before medieval lords figured out how to tax sunlight and personal happiness, rivers were the one thing peasants could rely on. Water flowed freely, fish swam peacefully, and the only real danger was drowning, which, frankly, was still better than running into your landlord. Back then, rivers were community lifelines. You drank from them, washed in them, dumped questionable things into them, and pretended not to see your neighbor doing the same. It was a naturally open access system, perfect for people with zero money, zero rights, and absolutely no energy left. And then, one afternoon, a nobleman on horseback stopped beside the river, stared at the water as if it had insulted his boots, and declared, "This shall now be taxed." Imagine the shock. Peasants froze mid-drink, like medieval deer caught in the headlights. "Taxed, my lord? But the river moves." "Yes," he replied, "and now it moves for me." To fix this tragedy, the council introduced an ale tax, a brilliant invention designed to ensure that the only safe drink in medieval Europe now required government approval. Suddenly, your humble brewing pot transformed from a family tradition into a suspicious object of state interest. Inspectors began prowling through villages, sniffing the air like overworked bloodhounds, searching for the unmistakable smell of unlicensed joy. A woman stirring a pot in her kitchen could be confronted by a sweaty official demanding to know whether she was making soup or engaging in unsanctioned beverage production. There was no correct answer. To brew legally, peasants had to visit the aleconner, a man whose job was to taste beer professionally and whose liver had long since retired. He would decide, with the solemnity of a judge sentencing a criminal, whether your beer was worthy of public consumption. If approved, you paid a fee. If not approved, you still paid a fee. Medieval justice was refreshingly predictable. Brewing without permission became a dangerous underground activity. Families brewed at night behind shuttered windows, praying that their bubbling barley mash wouldn't betray them with a loud hiss at the wrong moment. Children acted as lookouts, watching for the dim glow of the tax collector's lantern. Entire neighborhoods developed a secret network of signals, like birds, but more terrified, just to warn each other when inspectors were approaching. In the end, medieval beer was no longer the humble drink that connected thirsty peasants to survival. It became a symbol of everything wrong with the Middle Ages: corruption, regulation, and the unshakable belief among the elite that joy must always come with a receipt. Forests were once the medieval peasant's closest thing to a spa retreat. By the time Legio Exfertensis received orders to leave the Mediterranean world behind and march into the unpredictable furnace of Judea, they were no longer just Caesar's old shock troops. They were a hardened instrument of imperial will. Years of civil wars, frontier policing, and imperial reshuffling had conditioned them into something colder than loyalty and sharper than discipline. They were a legion that expected trouble and felt insulted if a province failed to provide any. Judea, however, was not going to disappoint them. The province was already simmering when Legio X arrived. Local tensions, religious divisions, and Rome's talent for overtaxing everyone had created a pot ready to boil over. Even from a distance, the legionaries knew they were walking into a storm. Rumors traveled faster than marching columns. Stories of uprisings, ambushes, fanatical rebels, and towns that refused to stay conquered. It wasn't the peaceful retirement post older soldiers joked about. It was a powder keg, and Legio X, as usual, brought the spark under the command of generals who trusted force more than diplomacy. The legion marched south, passing through landscapes that felt increasingly foreign. The breezy coasts and fertile plains of the Mediterranean were replaced by harsh hills, scorching sun, and fortresses clinging to cliffs like stubborn barnacles. Many Roman soldiers disliked Judea instantly. It was hot, dry, and full of people who refused to be impressed by Roman armor. But Legio X wasn't here to make friends. They were here to impose silence on a land that resisted silence. The legion established its early positions in coastal strongholds such as Caesarea, but their true crucible would lie inland. The province was fractured into pockets of resistance, some small, some frighteningly organized. Every hill seemed to have a lookout, and every road had the potential for trouble. Patrols were attacked, supply lines were harassed, scouts vanished. Rome responded with overwhelming force, multiple legions converging on the region. And in the center of that storm, again stood Legio Exfertensis. Hardened by years of harsh service, they dismantled rebel strongholds, collapsed cave systems, and pursued fighters through deserts and ravines. When the rebellion finally snapped, the cost in lives and cities was unprecedented. The legion had helped crush not just a revolt, but the possibility of future independence. Afterward, the Roman authorities rebuilt the region into a new identity, a province renamed Syria Palestina. The old symbols were erased, the old ways restricted, the old memories smothered under Roman urban planning. And Legio X remained stationed in the new provincial capital, Aelia Capitolina, once Jerusalem, now a Roman colony with temples to Jupiter and squares paved over destroyed neighborhoods. Even when centuries passed and the legion's veterans were buried, their mark survived. Coins bearing their boar emblem were still found in the soil, forts built by their engineers still clung to ridges and plains, and inscriptions carved by bored soldiers on stones and slabs still told fragments of their presence. And the memory of the wars they fought, the sieges, the fires, the destruction, lived on in the stories of those who survived them. Legio Exfertensis was more than a military unit. It was an era, a force that reshaped landscapes, cultures, and destinies. Its legacy was written not on parchment, but in the ashes of cities and the scars of a people who endured its might. And centuries later, history still remembers the boar of Judea. By the 12th century, Europe's once quiet towns had transformed into noisy, competitive, and chaotic centers of trade. Carts jammed the narrow streets, workshops spilled noise and smoke into the alleys, foreign merchants unloaded goods at dawn, bakers shouted prices, and tanners stank up entire districts. However, by the 13th century, tensions began to simmer beneath the surface, eventually erupting into open political warfare. The core of the conflict centered on a fundamental question: who truly controlled the city? Guilds sought to safeguard their crafts, while merchants aimed to expand trade. While these goals might appear harmonious, they were not. Merchants desired the freedom to buy and sell from any source, anywhere, at the most favorable price. Guilds, conversely, insisted that all goods undergo their quality inspections, adhere to price limits, and respect their monopolies. To merchants, guild rules felt like oppressive chains. To guilds, the merchants' pursuit of freedom seemed to threaten centuries of tradition. In numerous towns, this rivalry evolved into entrenched political factions. Merchant families formed councils, alliances, and urban elites. Guilds countered by organizing themselves into coalitions, sometimes encompassing dozens of trades, uniting to resist merchant dominance. Town councils transformed into battlegrounds where bakers, butchers, cobblers, and smiths debated against wealthy traders importing cloth from Bruges or spices from Venice. Certain cities leaned towards the merchants. In places like Lubeck or Genoa, merchants commanded fleets, tax revenues, and boasted international connections. They relegated guilds to secondary roles. Yet, in other locales, Florence, Ghent, and Cologne, guilds seized complete control of city governments, transforming urban life into a world governed by craftsmen. This power struggle could turn violent, as exemplified by the Ciompi Revolt in Florence, where wool workers revolted against merchant oligarchs. In Ghent, guild militias paraded through the streets brandishing axes and banners. In London, the tension between craft guilds and merchant guilds shaped city politics for generations. Medieval urban life was anything but serene. The ensuing struggle was swift and brutal. The empire's most beloved prince was strangled with a silken bowstring, a shocking act that sent shockwaves throughout the realm. News of Mustafa's death rippled across the empire, eliciting widespread grief and outrage. Soldiers openly wept, foreign courts recoiled in horror, and the Janissaries murmured with barely suppressed anger. Hurrem's name became inextricably linked to the tragedy, with some branding her as the mastermind, others as a convenient scapegoat, but all acknowledging her profound influence. For her sons, Mustafa's death cleared the path to the throne, but for the empire, it signaled the beginning of internal divisions that would plague Sulayman's final years. And for Hurrem, it marked the point of no return, the moment she irrevocably stepped into the heart of imperial destiny, forever relinquishing the safety and seclusion of the harem. By the time Prince Mustafa was gone, Hurrem Sultan had reached the zenith of her influence. No woman before her had ever wielded such power. She was no longer simply Sulayman's beloved wife or the mother of princes. She had transformed into a formidable political force whose decisions resonated from the palace halls to the farthest reaches of the empire. Unlike many who attained such heights of power, Hurrem did not merely bask in its glory. She actively used it. Her first arena was diplomacy. While most royal women in other parts of the world remained silent and unseen figures, Hurrem engaged in direct correspondence with foreign rulers, including the kings of Poland, the Shahs of Persia, and various European ambassadors. In these letters, she expressed her concerns, urged peace, offered condolences, and commented on international affairs with remarkable intelligence, charm, and subtle strategic acumen. She presented herself not as a hidden figure, but as a partner in governance, a stance that both stunned and intrigued diplomats. This is how river tolls were born, the medieval equivalent of charging people for breathing. If you crossed the river, you paid. If you didn't cross the river, sometimes you still paid because, according to the noble, the privilege of potentially crossing someday was worth something. They built wooden toll bridges, even across shallow streams you could easily wade through. Try wading instead of using the bridge. Congratulations, you've just committed toll evasion, a crime punishable by fines, or, if the guard was bored, a quick drowning demonstration. The peasants tried arguing. But the river belongs to God. Yes, the Lord agreed, and God gave me permission. Now pay. The worst part? Lords didn't clean the rivers, they didn't maintain them, they didn't even know how rivers worked. These were the kind of men who believed water flowed downhill out of sheer respect for authority. And yet, they taxed it anyway. Some areas got creative. They introduced drinking fees, hydration taxes, fishing fees, fish theft taxes, bridge fees, walking over water taxes, and even viewing fees, yes, a scenic observation fee. One village even charged people for letting their livestock think about crossing the river. That's right, cows contemplating the stream were now a taxable event. By the end of the century, rivers that had existed peacefully for millions of years had become medieval ATMs. Except instead of giving you money, they took it from you. All because one man looked at water and thought, how do I make this worse? Long before lords invented the everything tax, peasants had one reliable, peaceful ritual: grinding their grain at home. Every family owned a little handmill, 2 rocks, some arm strength, and the faint hope that this year's harvest wouldn't taste like soil and depression. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it was free, which in the Middle Ages made it dangerously suspicious. They wandered in, collected mushrooms that may or may not kill them, gathered sticks, hunted the occasional rabbit, and enjoyed nature's free offerings, all while praying they wouldn't run into wolves, bandits, or their landlord. It wasn't glamorous, but at least it was free. Then kings and nobles discovered forests, not the trees, not the ecosystem, not the concept of nature. No, they discovered the possibilities of charging people for touching leaves. Suddenly, vast woodland areas became royal forests, a title that suggested majesty while actually meaning nobody else is allowed to use this. The announcement came down like a thunderstrike of stupidity. One day, the forest was simply a forest. The next, it was transformed into a sacred, untouchable sanctuary reserved exclusively for the nobility's favorite hobbies: hunting, riding, and pretending they were doing something important. Peasants were stunned. The forest had been their lifeline forever. It provided fuel, food, herbs, and occasionally a quiet place to scream into the void. Now they were told to stay out. Of course, they couldn't venture out unless they were willing to risk fines, imprisonment, or the medieval equivalent of a strongly worded letter, having a guard menacingly shake a spear in their face. Even worse, the king's deer suddenly became more valuable than the peasants themselves. Killing a deer without royal permission was considered as serious as treason. In some areas, it was a capital offense, while killing a peasant might only result in a minor inconvenience. If a nobleman happened to run you over while hunting, you were expected to apologize for damaging his horse. The royal hunting parties only exacerbated the situation, with 100 nobles descending upon the forest, trumpets blaring, horses galloping, and dogs barking as if they were a unionized workforce. In Roman terms, this meant only one thing: a full-scale rebellion was coming. And when it hit, Rome would answer with overwhelming force. Legio X was soon assigned to the incoming imperial commander, Titus, son of the emperor, ambitious, strategic, and perfectly willing to break a city if it wouldn't obey. The men of the legion sharpened their blades, oiled their armor, and prepared for a campaign that even by Roman standards promised brutality. They were marching toward the heart of the revolt, toward Jerusalem, toward a siege that would turn their name, once associated with Caesar's naval daring, into a symbol of destruction carved into the memory of an entire region. When Legio X Fretensis finally stood before Jerusalem, they saw not just a city, but a fortress layered in stone, faith, and defiance. The rebels had turned every wall, tower, and gate into a declaration of resistance. For the legionaries, who had fought in deserts, forests, and coastal straits, Jerusalem presented a new kind of challenge, one that was equal parts military puzzle and psychological war. The city meant everything to its defenders, and that kind of devotion often made sieges far uglier than Rome preferred. Titus knew this. He understood that the rebellion wouldn't be crushed by speed or dramatic charges, but by patience and precision. And so, Legio X, along with the other legions marching under his banner, set about doing what Rome did best, turning a city into a cage. The first step was encirclement. No one would leave, no one would enter. Food and hope would begin to dry up together. Legio X was positioned on the Mount of Olives, east of the city, close enough to see the walls, the temples, the markets, even the rooftops where watchers stood like statues. From here, the legion's engineers wasted no time. They began constructing siege camps, watchtowers, palisades, and artillery platforms. The thud of hammers, the groan of wood, and the grinding of stone echoed across the hills. And in the middle of all this, craftsmen faced a growing problem. Freedom. Not the romantic kind, but the dangerous, unregulated kind, where anyone could claim to be a carpenter, a butcher, a shoemaker, or, heaven forbid, a surgeon with nothing but a knife and confidence. Markets were swelling, but so were the risks. Fraudsters sold watered-down ale. Butchers stretched meat supplies with tricks better left undescribed. Weavers copied patterns without skill, and newcomers, drawn from countryside and slums, jumped into trades without training, undercutting prices and threatening reputations. For a medieval craftsman, your name was everything. If customers no longer trusted the quality of your work, your livelihood collapsed. Something had to bring order. The solution didn't come from kings or bishops. It came from the craftsmen themselves. They began forming sworn associations, groups of workers united not by blood or lordship, but by trade. These were the first guilds, alliances built for survival in a world where markets grew faster than rules. At first, they were small circles of craftsmen agreeing on basic standards. A baker could not sell bread that crumbled to dust. A blacksmith could not forge horseshoes that snapped after 2 steps. And a shoemaker could not stitch leather so thin it tore in the rain. The guild protected all honest workers by ensuring that every member followed the same quality code. But as towns expanded, so did guild ambitions. They realized that if they controlled quality, they might as well control everything else. Prices, training, competition, even who was allowed to practice a craft at all. What began as a pact of cooperation slowly hardened into a system of power. Joining a guild was no longer casual. It was a privilege. Members swore oaths, paid dues, attended meetings, and defended their shared interests like a brotherhood. Beneath the sounds of ringing hammers and bustling markets lay a constant tug-of-war over authority. Despite the conflict, each side remained dependent on the other. A merchant without goods was powerless, while a craftsman without buyers faced equal impotence. This rivalry gave rise to a paradox. Cities thrived most when both forces balanced each other, keeping ambition and regulation in check. However, this delicate equilibrium was fragile. Economic crises, plagues, and political upheavals could dramatically alter the balance. By the 14th century, the world stood on the cusp of change, ushering guilds into their golden age and eventually their long decline. For all their pronouncements of brotherhood and solidarity, guilds were far from open systems. They functioned as gatekeepers, polished, ritualized, respected gatekeepers, but gatekeepers nonetheless. This was nowhere more evident than in the way guilds treated women, migrants, and unlicensed workers. The medieval guild system may have shaped entire towns, but it certainly did not shape them equitably. Women's roles varied substantially across Europe. In many crafts, brewing, textile work, and baking, women were indispensable. They spun wool, brewed ale, stitched garments, and managed market stalls. In some instances, they even inherited workshops or continued businesses following their husbands' deaths. Yet, despite their essential contributions, guild leadership rarely welcomed them into their ranks. Women might appear in records as craftswomen, brewers, or alewives. However, they were frequently barred from full membership and excluded from voting, holding office, or training apprentices. There were exceptions. Certain guilds, especially in the textile towns of Flanders or the brewing centers of England, allowed women limited membership or partial rights. Nevertheless, even then, the guild's upper echelons remained overwhelmingly male. Some praised her audacity, others feared her influence, but none could afford to ignore her. Her second arena was charity and public works. Hurrem understood that power was reinforced not only through alliances but also through public reputation. She commissioned numerous grand architectural projects, including mosques, schools, bathhouses, soup kitchens, and caravanserais stretching from Istanbul to Jerusalem. Her most famous endeavor was the Haseki Hurrem Sultan Complex, HKI, a sprawling institution that offered shelter, education, and medical care to thousands. Through these initiatives, Hurrem created a lasting legacy that touched the lives of ordinary people, softening her image as a political manipulator and reinforcing her identity as a protector of the poor and vulnerable. However, Hurrem's influence extended beyond diplomacy and public works. It reached deep into the inner workings of the palace. She understood the intricate dynamics between the powerful eunuchs, viziers, and pashas. Rustam Pasha, her trusted ally and son-in-law, remained the Grand Vizier, granting her a direct voice in imperial decisions. Through him, she shaped military campaigns, tax reforms, and diplomatic strategies. Their partnership blurred the traditional lines between harem politics and statecraft, establishing a new model of female power within the empire. Within the palace walls, Hurrem also reformed the structure of the harem itself. She reorganized roles, ensured better training for servants and concubines, and cultivated loyalty through a combination of kindness and calculated generosity. Under her guidance, the harem evolved from a mere residence into a well-disciplined, efficient, and politically connected institution. The world around her was changing. What had once been a male-dominated realm of campaigns and councils was now influenced by a woman who had begun her life as a slave. Enter the medieval lord, a man who couldn't identify a wheat stalk if you smacked him in the face with it. One morning, he heard a horrifying sound drifting across his manor lands. Peasants grinding grain without giving him money. That rhythmic scraping noise? That wasn't industry. That was lost revenue. So he rode into the village, pointed dramatically at everyone's innocent little grinding stones, and declared, "These are now illegal." Just like that, the hand mills, tools peasants had used for generations, became contraband. Owning one was suddenly the medieval equivalent of running an underground casino. Instead, everyone was now forced to bring their grain to the lord's monopoly mill, operated by a man who definitely didn't wash his hands and definitely judged your grain quality. The process was simple. Carry your heavy sack of grain to the mill, wait behind 20 other miserable people, pay a fee, watch as the miller accidentally keeps the best handfuls for himself, pay a second fee just because he felt like it, and return home with less flour than you started with and significantly less will to live. Try grinding grain at home anyway? Mill inspectors, yes, those existed, would raid your cottage, confiscate your stones, and fine you for the crime of unauthorized crushing. If they caught you twice, they destroyed your millstones completely, which sounds dramatic until you remember they were just rocks. Breaking them was essentially a public tantrum. One lord even wrote in his records, "The peasants must not grind grain themselves, for independence breeds arrogance." Translated, I can't charge them if they're doing it efficiently. The worst part? The lord's mill didn't exactly work well. It broke often, got stuck, flooded, froze, caught fire, or randomly exploded because nobody understood physics yet. But peasants had no choice. Whether the mill functioned or not, the fee remained consistent. After scaring away every animal within a 10-mile radius, they would declare the forest overused and impose even stricter restrictions on the peasants. Some peasants, desperate for resources, would sneak into the forest at night, tiptoeing through the undergrowth like medieval ninjas, gathering herbs in terrified silence. Every snapped twig sounded like a death sentence, and every owl hoot seemed like a guard shouting. Heaven forbid they should accidentally stumble upon a deer. They would have to pretend they hadn't seen it, hadn't noticed it, and certainly hadn't considered hunting it. Thus, the forest, once a symbol of freedom, became yet another monument to medieval inequality. The trees remained the same, but the laws changed, and with the stroke of a quill, nature itself became a gated community accessible only to the privileged. Marriage in the medieval world was meant to be simple. Two people met, decided they could tolerate each other's existence, and joined forces to survive famine, taxes, and aggressive geese. It wasn't romantic, but it was efficient, like forming a two-person alliance against a very angry universe. But then a lord realized there was an activity occurring on his land from which he wasn't profiting. Peasants getting married. The horror. Two individuals creating a household without paying him first. Scandalous, dangerous, potentially revolutionary. So, naturally, he invented the marriage fee because nothing celebrates love like financial punishment. This fee was called merchet, a word that sounds like a small, harmless pastry, but actually meant, pay me, or your daughter isn't legally allowed to leave your house. Yes, medieval lords essentially charged fathers for the privilege of allowing their daughters to marry someone else. Imagine being a weary farmer scraping together coins, not for a wedding feast, but for the right to legally stop feeding your adult child. It was the most absurd medieval financial transaction imaginable. The rebels could see it happening, and the psychological pressure built with every structure completed. But the defenders weren't idle. They launched sorties, sudden, vicious attacks meant to disrupt the Roman works. Legio X found itself in constant skirmishes. One moment they were building ramps, the next they were grabbing shields to repel screaming fighters charging down the slope. The rebels fought with a ferocity that impressed even the hardened veterans of the Legion. These weren't disorganized raiders. They were desperate, skilled, and intimately familiar with their terrain. Still, Legio X pressed on. Their artillery crews brought up ballistae and scorpions, machines capable of launching bolts and stones with enough force to impale a man through a shield. The Legion began hurling projectiles into the city, not just to damage structures, but to wear down morale. Each strike was a reminder. Rome had come to end this rebellion, and Legio X intended to finish the job. The siege was only in its opening phase, but the pattern was already clear. An unstoppable machine tightening its grip. The city might have walls, but Legio X had time, iron, and an emperor's patience. And in a Roman siege, patience was often the deadliest weapon. As the siege stretched on, Legio X Fretensis settled into the rhythm of slow, methodical destruction. Sieges were not glamorous. They were grinding contests of endurance. But for a legion with decades of brutal experience, this was familiar ground. The men of Legio X understood that every hour spent building, hammering, dragging stone, or firing artillery was another thread tightening around Jerusalem's throat. The city's outer defenses were formidable. The rebels had fortified them with fresh masonry, watchtowers, barricades, and a determination born from faith and desperation. Apprenticeships ensured skills were passed down correctly, journeymen traveled to learn, and masters oversaw standards and protected secrets. Anyone working outside the system became a threat, and guilds crushed threats with enthusiasm. In a world where kings ruled kingdoms and lords ruled lands, guilds ruled the streets, and their rise would reshape medieval life more profoundly than anyone expected. To understand how the guild system rose to power, you have to start at its beating heart, the training ladder. Medieval crafts weren't learned through books or classrooms. They were absorbed through sleepless nights, calloused hands, and years spent under the watchful eye of a master. And guilds made sure that every craftsman, whether a baker, blacksmith, cooper, or goldsmith, followed the same path. It began with the apprentice, often a boy as young as 10 or 12. His parents negotiated a contract with a master, promising obedience in exchange for training, food, and a place to sleep, usually in the workshop itself. Apprenticeship wasn't romantic. It was exhausting. They swept floors, chopped wood, stirred vats, fetched water, stretched hides, and endured endless scolding while learning the first fragile steps of the craft. But this crucible forged loyalty. The guild wanted discipline, tradition, and consistency, and apprentices absorbed all three before they ever touched a tool unsupervised. After years, sometimes 7, the apprentice became a journeyman, literally a day worker. Now he was paid for his labor, free to travel, and able to work in different shops. Guilds encouraged this wandering. Journeymen carried techniques from town to town, spreading skills like pollen. A Parisian stonemason might learn a trick in Cologne. A Flemish weaver might bring patterns back from Florence. Trade routes became rivers of shared knowledge, and guilds controlled the flow. Yet the journeyman faced a daunting finish line, becoming a master. The system relied heavily on family labor and the work of wives and daughters, but official power remained firmly entrenched in the hands of men. Migrants encountered a different form of exclusion. Growing towns attracted workers from the countryside, refugees from wars, and ambitious craftsmen seeking better opportunities. However, guilds tightly controlled who could join their ranks. Admission fees were high, the apprenticeship process lengthy, and local favoritism rampant. Outsiders could only work as assistants or day laborers, never ascending to the rank of master without a sponsor. In response, unlicensed workers emerged, craftsmen who operated outside guild regulations. Some repaired shoes in alleys, while others forged nails in hidden workshops. Many were simply impoverished individuals attempting to survive. Guilds labeled them interlopers, foreigners, or illegal craftsmen and relentlessly combated their activities. Wardens raided their shops, seized their tools, fined them, or publicly humiliated them as warnings. Yet guilds could not completely eradicate them. As cities expanded, the demand for cheap labor grew. Unlicensed workers filled that gap quietly, unofficially, and often dangerously, as their lack of regulation led to poor training and low-quality goods. Tensions simmered. Guilds despised them, townspeople relied on them, and authorities balanced between guild strictness and urban necessities. These marginalized groups, women, migrants, and unlicensed craftsmen, lived in the shadow of guild dominance. They were essential yet excluded, contributing to a commercial world that rarely acknowledged their role. As the 14th century approached, these tensions simmering at the edges of the system would become impossible to ignore. The 14th century arrived with the force of a hammer, bringing war, famine, and economic turmoil, cracking the stability that medieval towns had painstakingly built. Yet nothing struck harder than the Black Death. Hurrem didn't simply navigate the Ottoman court. She reshaped it, laying the foundation for the era known as the Sultanate of Women, a period in which imperial mothers and wives would exert considerable influence on politics for generations to come. Her power was immense, her reach undeniable, but the price of such influence was yet to be fully paid. As the years passed, the brilliant flame of Hurrem Sultan's rise began to flicker, not because her power waned, but because the weight of time, grief, and illness began to take its toll. Even at the height of her authority, she lived within a court defined by tension and intrigue. The death of Prince Mustafa had secured her son's futures, but it had also fractured the empire. Soldiers murmured their discontent, advisors whispered their suspicions, and the Janissaries never fully forgave her perceived role in the tragedy. Every decision Suleiman made was now viewed through the lens of suspicion, with many believing that Hurrem had unduly influenced him. Yet, despite the challenges and criticisms, she remained indispensable. Her closest allies, particularly Rustam Pasha, continued to hold key positions. Her children had grown into adults with courts of their own. Miraima, her daughter, had become her political protégé, intelligent, poised, and fiercely loyal. Together, mother and daughter formed a formidable force in Suleiman's emotional world, advising him during moments of uncertainty and providing support through the losses that marked his later reign. However, Hurrem's health began to decline. Letters from this period reveal a woman who remained sharp and resolute, but was also weary, battling waves of pain and chronic illness. Despite her failing health, she refused to retreat from the political arena. This was medieval innovation at its finest. Take something free, make it worse, charge money, and call it progress. Firewood was the medieval peasant's emotional support system. Cold? Firewood. Hungry? Firewood. Sad about the crushing weight of feudalism? Firewood, and maybe some quiet crying behind the barn. It was the one resource peasants could collect without permission, paperwork, or being lectured about trespassing on the Lord's aura. Fell off trees naturally. God supplied it directly. No middleman needed, which, of course, meant disaster was imminent. One crisp morning, the local baron, a man who possessed the economic instincts of a parking meter with legs, rode through his forest and spotted something horrifying. A peasant bending over to pick up a stick, a single, pathetic stick. A stick that probably didn't even burn well. And yet, the Baron's mind began to vibrate with profit-driven rage. From his perspective, he had just caught someone stealing heat from right under his nose. From the peasant's perspective, he had just bent down to pick up a twig, like a normal human who doesn't overthink branches. Naturally, the Baron returned to his manor, poured himself an overpriced goblet of wine, stared at the wall for a few minutes, and had a revelation. What if I owned every stick in this forest? By the end of the week, proclamations went up, declaring the woods protected royal timberland, which was medieval lord-speak for, I am now charging money for something I didn't know existed until 7 minutes ago. Peasants were stunned. How could anyone own fallen wood? The trees didn't sign contracts. Gravity did most of the labor. But in the Middle Ages, ownership wasn't about logic. It was about who had the fanciest boots and the least empathy. Soon, collecting firewood required permission from the Baron, which he granted generously for a small fee the size of your soul. The ridiculous part was that this fee had absolutely nothing to do with the wedding itself. You still needed money for food, clothing, ale, and the priest, who was already practicing his disappointed face. The marchet was simply the Lord's way of saying, I noticed you're happy. Please pay to continue. Some lords took their role far too seriously. They kept detailed lists of eligible women, as if running an incredibly creepy subscription service. If a daughter married without paying, the lord could fine the entire family, refuse to recognize the marriage, or, in extreme cases, forcibly bring her back to her father's house, which understandably ruined the honeymoon. Peasants tried to push back. A few brave souls attempted secret weddings at night, officiated by friendly monks who had long given up on earthly logic. But secrecy was difficult in a village where everyone shared walls thin enough to hear a fly sneeze. News traveled fast, and so did the Lord's tax collectors. The worst cases involved widows. If a widow remarried, she often owed another fee because, apparently, surviving one husband wasn't challenging enough. Medieval bureaucracy was determined to charge you for every milestone. Birth, marriage, death, and anything fun in between. In the end, marriage, a simple human union, became yet another medieval paywall. Love may have been free, but expressing it legally required small coins, enormous patience, and a lord who hovered over your happiness like a hawk with financial anxiety. Bridges were once simple structures in the medieval world. A few planks stretched across a stream, built by monks who had nothing better to do between praying and debating how sinful cheese was. These bridges allowed peasants to cross rivers without drowning, freezing, or getting swept away like leaves with poor financial planning. They were free, functional, and occasionally even sturdy, three qualities that immediately made lords suspicious. Legio ex Fretensis, stationed on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, had one specific task: weaken the eastern walls until they cracked open like a clay pot under a hammer. But the defenders knew the terrain better and launched constant attacks from the gates and hidden paths. The legionaries found themselves fighting in chaotic bursts. Short, vicious clashes that left dust, blood, and broken tools scattered across the ground. The Romans responded the only way they knew how, by bringing in heavier equipment. Engineers from Legio X constructed towering siege platforms known as agers, as well as massive battering rams coated with wet hides to prevent them from being set on fire. The defenders hurled burning torches, pots of pitch, and even molten substances at them, but the legionaries kept pushing. Every step the rams advanced felt like pushing against the heartbeat of the city itself. Meanwhile, Roman artillery crews worked tirelessly. Ballistae snapped, scorpions twanged, and stones crashed against the walls. Each impact chipped away at the defenders' confidence. The rebels retaliated with slings, arrows, and curses shouted from the battlements. Yet Legio X simply adjusted formation, raised shields, and marched forward again. This relentlessness, cold, disciplined, mechanical, was what terrified Rome's enemies far more than the weapons. Eventually, the constant bombardment paid off. Cracks spidered through the masonry, stones loosened, and sections of the wall sagged under their own weight. The defenders scrambled to reinforce weak points, stacking debris and timbers in a frantic attempt to keep Roman steel out. But the legionaries could smell collapse. They felt it in the trembling ground and saw it in the bulging foundations. Every legionary knew what came next. Once the walls gave way, the battle would shift from engineering to slaughter. Street fighting, house to house, temple to courtyard. This wasn't automatic. It required approval, fees, and above all, a masterpiece. A flawless item crafted to prove that he had truly mastered the craft. Some guilds demanded a chest with perfect joinery, a silver chalice without dents, a loaf of bread with the right weight, or a shoe stitched so well it seemed grown rather than made. Masters were the elite. They owned workshops, trained apprentices, set prices, and voted in guild councils. They guarded techniques like treasure, a recipe, a dye formula, a blade tempering method. These were secrets worth protecting. Masters formed the backbone of guild power, shaping not only the craft but the economic life of the city. This rigid ladder, apprentice, journeyman, master, created uniformity, stability, and pride, but it also created barriers. Outsiders, innovators, and unlicensed workers found the gates closed. And those who tried to open their own workshops without permission soon learned that guild brotherhood could be as crushing as it was protective. If medieval towns had kings and lords, guilds had something even more frightening. Rules. Not loose guidelines or friendly suggestions, but strict sworn codes that every member had to obey. These rules governed everything from how to bake bread to how to tan leather, how to measure cloth, how to set prices, and even how early a workshop could open its doors. In a world where chaos and competition threatened livelihoods, guilds created a fortress of order. To join, a craftsman swore an oath, public, solemn, and binding. These oaths weren't poetic. They were promises to uphold quality, protect secrets, respect fellow members, and follow regulations that could be astonishingly detailed. A guild of bakers might dictate the exact weight of a loaf. A guild of butchers might specify which parts of an animal could be sold fresh and which must be salted. And a guild of goldsmiths insisted on purity tests, hallmarks, and regular inspections. Nothing was left to chance. When the plague swept across Europe, claiming a third to half of the population, it didn't merely end lives. It shattered the labor market. Workshops were left vacant. Masters died along with entire households, journeymen fled, and apprentices vanished. Streets once filled with the echoes of hammers and market cries fell into an eerie silence. Paradoxically, this catastrophe marked the pinnacle of guild power. Guilds had always controlled the labor supply, but now labor was scarce, and scarcity translated into leverage. Surviving craftsmen found themselves in unprecedented demand. Journeymen could demand higher wages, apprenticeship terms shifted, and masters gained even greater control as towns pleaded with them to restore production. Governments, desperate for stability, leaned on guilds to regulate prices and prevent chaos. For a brief period, guilds became the unquestioned arbiters of economic life. Yet, with newfound power came new responsibilities and new conflicts. Across Europe, guilds intervened to repair collapsing economies. They established emergency price controls to prevent gouging, redistributed tools and materials left behind in abandoned workshops, and coordinated rebuilding efforts, particularly in industries vital for survival, such as baking, smithing, brewing, and milling. Some guilds opened their coffers to support widows and orphans, while others enforced strict curfews to prevent looting during plague outbreaks. Yet, beneath the veneer of order, struggles simmered. Journeymen, newly empowered by labor shortages, pushed back against masters, demanding higher pay or shorter workdays. Others formed brotherhoods, proto-unions, directly challenging guild hierarchy. Masters, threatened by this rising assertiveness, tightened entry requirements, increased fees, and defended their authority with renewed ferocity. She continued to oversee her charitable foundations, mediate political disputes, send instructions to her allies, and guide her sons, particularly Selim and Bayezid, whose rivalry was beginning to mirror the dangerous pattern of Ottoman succession struggles. As her strength diminished, she worked tirelessly to secure the empire's stability beyond her own lifetime. She strengthened Marima's political role, encouraged Rustam Pasha to maintain a firm grip on state affairs, and desperately tried to maintain peace between her increasingly contentious sons. But the underlying tensions within the empire could not be suppressed indefinitely. Selim, though indulgent, was considered politically dependable. Bayezid, on the other hand, was passionate and immensely popular, perhaps too popular for his own good. The specter of another succession conflict loomed large, and Hurrem was acutely aware of the danger. Her relationship with Suleiman remained strong until the very end. He visited her frequently, sought her counsel, and shared his deepest griefs with her. The death of their son Sahangir, the exhaustion of long and arduous campaigns, and the lingering wounds that time could never fully heal. Their bond, which had begun as an improbable romance between a sultan and a slave girl, had evolved into a lifelong partnership forged in the crucible of power. In 1558, Hurrem's body finally succumbed to illness. The woman who had shaped an empire from behind lattice screens died in Istanbul, leaving behind a political landscape she had profoundly altered and a dynasty forever transformed by her presence. Her death sent shockwaves through the palace, but her influence lingered on. The world she had created would endure long after her final breath. When Hurrem Sultan died in 1558, an uneasy silence fell over the palace. The woman who had once arrived as a trembling captive was now buried in a mausoleum beside Suleiman's future tomb, an honor unprecedented for a concubine. Peasants trudged into the forest with permits dangling from their belts like sad ornaments, praying they wouldn't run into the baron's guards, men who lurked behind trees, waiting to jump out and yell things like, "Drop the stick, criminal!" Ironically, peasants began collecting firewood illegally at night, sneaking through the forest like underpaid ninjas, gripping twigs as if they were precious jewels. Meanwhile, the baron slept peacefully, dreaming of new ways to charge people for oxygen. Worst of all, if a peasant accidentally picked up a branch that was too fresh, they were accused of cutting live wood. That crime came with punishments so disproportionate you'd think the baron was avenging a fallen family member. And so firewood, once free, abundant, and blessed by nature, became a premium service in the grand medieval tradition of, if peasants need it, charge for it. Walking used to be the one activity medieval peasants could do without consequences. They walked to fields, to markets, to church, to their own doom, all for free. Their entire lifestyle was essentially one long, miserable hike. But even this simple act was deemed too joyful, too liberating, too dangerously independent for the ruling class. It started innocently enough. A baron decided to improve the main road by removing 2 rocks and telling everyone he had modernized infrastructure. Naturally, he then built a wooden gate across it, not for defense, not for decoration, but for the sole purpose of charging people for the privilege of continuing their miserable existence in a straight line. The first peasant to encounter the gate stood in front of it for a full minute, trying to decide whether this was a joke or the beginning of something historically stupid. A guard stepped out, bored, holding a spear that suggested he had not been trained to use it. The guard announced with great ceremony, "To pass, you must pay the road toll." The peasant blinked, confused. The moment a nobleman realized peasants were safely crossing water without paying for the privilege, he experienced a spiritual awakening. He stared at that humble wooden bridge and saw not a communal good, but a missed opportunity. Within days, a gate appeared at one end of the bridge, along with a guard who treated this 6-foot structure as if it were the entrance to a royal palace. Suddenly, crossing a bridge required payment, not because the bridge needed repairs, though it always needed repairs, nor because it improved safety, it never improved safety, but because the Lord decided that convenience was a luxury item. Peasants who attempted to cross were intercepted by a guard who asked with tragic seriousness, "Toll, please," as if demanding payment for walking across a glorified wooden toothpick was the most natural thing in the world. If a peasant asked why the toll existed, the guard would look at them with the defeated eyes of a man who had asked the same question himself and had not enjoyed the consequences. The official explanation was bridge maintenance, which was interesting considering the bridge hadn't been maintained since the day it was built. Half the planks were loose, the other half were rotting, and the whole thing wobbled like it had a personal vendetta against gravity. Some peasants attempted to ford the river instead, believing that drowning was preferable to paying the toll. but the Lord had anticipated this. Anyone caught crossing through the water was fined for illegal bypassing of authorized infrastructure, proving once again that medieval law was written by people who had never paid a bill in their life. The tolls were outrageous. A farmer could cross the bridge and lose a week's wages. A merchant could cross with goods and lose a month's profits. A cow could cross and somehow also be charged, leading to the absurd situation of livestock with debt. Jerusalem would become a maze, and Legio Exvertensis would be the torch carried through it. The walls were failing, and the legion was ready to enter. When the walls finally buckled and sections collapsed into heaps of rubble, a roar went up, not just from Legio Exvertensis, but from every Roman soldier who understood what a breached wall meant. It was the signal that the siege, Legio Exvertensis, had entered its most perilous and pivotal phase. The fighting was now shifting into the city itself, where walls, alleys, and sacred grounds transformed every footstep into a potential battle. Unlike open terrain, Jerusalem's intricate layout favored those defending it. Initially, the legionaries of Legio X advanced with caution, having previously dealt with urban conflicts in Alexandria, Cyrene, and smaller rebellious towns. However, Jerusalem was different. A labyrinth of courtyards, narrow winding streets, sudden staircases, rooftop pathways, and fortified compounds. The rebels exploited this terrain as a formidable weapon. Around every corner lurked a slinger, behind every doorway a spearman, and upon every rooftop a barrage of stones. The legionaries, trained for open-field formation combat, had to rapidly adapt their tactics. Their shields became makeshift roofs, their formations became smaller and more flexible, and their movements were now slow and deliberate. Smoke soon enveloped the chaos. Fires erupted as artillery stones struck buildings, torches were thrown, and fierce fighting spilled into homes and marketplaces. The city began to suffocate under its own burning interior. For Legio X, the smoke reduced visibility but also incited panic among the defenders. Fire knows no allegiance, consuming rebels and Romans alike, destroying hiding places, collapsing rooftops, and forcing combatants into the open. Despite the escalating danger, the legion pressed onward. Their iron discipline held them together, unshaken amidst the chaos. This wasn't just about pride. It was economic warfare. By establishing universal standards, guilds made sure no member could undercut the others by using cheaper materials or sloppy methods. If one shoemaker sold thin-soled boots that fell apart after a week, customers might start distrusting all shoemakers. That was unacceptable. Quality wasn't simply a virtue, it was a defense mechanism. To enforce their rules, guilds appointed wardens or inspectors, men with the authority to walk into workshops unannounced and examine goods. If they found fraud, they didn't just lecture. They fined, confiscated, and publicly shamed. In extreme cases, they smashed substandard items in the street or expelled offenders entirely. And once expelled, a craftsman was finished. Without guild approval, no customer trusted you, and no workshop would hire you. Guild meetings, held in halls, taverns, or even churches, were many parliaments. Masters debated market conditions, reviewed apprentice progress, set seasonal prices, and issued punishments. Some guilds kept chests filled with emergency funds, tools, or documents. Others built chapels, commissioned altars, or funded feasts. But behind the camaraderie lay an iron core: control. The guild's power extended beyond economics. It shaped social life, festivals, parades, and charity. It overshadowed family ties, village loyalties, and sometimes even faith. A man's guild was his identity, and violating its rules was treated as a personal betrayal. The system worked because it had teeth. Guilds didn't ask for obedience. They demanded it. And in return, they offered something priceless in the unpredictable medieval world: stability. By the 13th century, guilds were no longer just groups of craftsmen trying to keep their standards high. They were economic powerhouses shaping entire towns. And nowhere was this more visible than in the bustling medieval markets. Cities, desperate to restore normalcy, sided with the guilds, relying on guild courts to mediate disputes and guild funds to rebuild infrastructure. Civic governments increasingly included guild representatives, giving craftsmen political voices they had never possessed before. In some towns, guilds effectively ran the government, creating administrations composed of bakers, butchers, weavers, and tanners rather than aristocrats or merchants. However, this was also the moment when cracks began to appear. Innovation slowed under the weight of strict regulations. As demand surged, guilds sometimes resisted new techniques that threatened traditional methods. Their tight control kept chaos at bay but also stifled experimentation. The plague had reshaped Europe, and guilds, stronger than ever, stood at the center of this transformed world. Powerful, respected, but increasingly rigid. The stage was set for the final act, their eventual decline. By the late 14th century, the guild system, once the engine of medieval urban life, stood at the zenith of its prestige. Guild halls dominated city squares, guild leaders sat on councils, and guild rituals shaped holidays and public life. But like many institutions that reached their peak, the system soon began to crack under the pressure of a rapidly changing world. The very strengths that had made guilds powerful, control, tradition, and exclusivity, transformed into weaknesses. As Europe entered a new age, the first challenge arose from expanding markets. Trade extended beyond the boundaries of individual towns. Merchant networks connected London to Bruges, Florence to Cairo, and Lubeck to Novgorod. Goods flowed faster and farther than ever before. Guild monopolies, once crucial for stability, now appeared as obstacles hindering commerce. Foreign cloth might be cheaper, imported metal tools sharper, and new dyes more vibrant, yet guilds fought to block them all, clinging to tradition even when customers clamored for change. It was a monument proclaiming that she had stood as his partner, not merely his possession. But her death was not the end of her story. It was, in many ways, a new beginning. The empire she left behind had been permanently reshaped by her hand. Her influence lived on primarily through her children. Selim, her son, eventually succeeded Suleiman, becoming Selim II. His ascension to the throne marked the culmination of Hurrem's long and perilous political strategy, a game she had been playing since the moment she gave birth to her first child. Muraima, her daughter, seamlessly stepped into her mother's role as a key political advisor, forming alliances and offering counsel with the same steady composure that Hurrem had instilled in her. Even after Rustam Pasha's death, the political network that Hurrem had so carefully cultivated continued to function, now guided by Muraima's intelligence and experience. However, Hurrem's most enduring legacy was structural. She had shattered the barrier that had traditionally separated the harem from the realm of state politics. Before her, the women of the harem lived behind curtains, wielding power only through whispers and veiled influence. After her, they became visible and active participants in imperial decision-making. Her life opened the door to the era that historians would later term the Sultanate of Women, a century-long period in which imperial mothers, daughters, and wives shaped diplomacy, architecture, education, and the very succession of sultans. Under her influence, the very concept of royal womanhood within the Ottoman Empire underwent a profound transformation. Charity became political capital, patronage became a tool of influence, letters became weapons, and motherhood evolved into a governing institution. The Hasiki Sultan, once a purely ceremonial title, became a vital pillar of statecraft. Yet, Hurrem's legacy remains a subject of debate and controversy. Walking was not a luxury. It was the only transportation he had besides collapsing from exhaustion. But the guard insisted. The Lord had declared that his roads needed maintenance, even though the roads consisted of mud sprinkled with hope and occasionally a dead sheep. Soon every traveler had to pay to pass. Merchants, monks, barefoot children carrying turnips, all lined up to pay money to walk on dirt they had already compacted with their own feet for generations. If you dared to walk around the gate through the grass instead, another guard would appear out of nowhere, as if grown directly from the soil, and demand a fine for unauthorized bypassing of lordly infrastructure. Worse still, some lords added tolls to roads they did not improve, did not own, and had never visited. They simply claimed the ground on the basis that it was visible from their tower on a clear day. If the peasants argued, the Lord responded with the medieval version of legal precedent. Because I said so. Soon walking became an economic gamble. Every trip required planning, budgeting, prayer, and maybe a backup prayer just in case. Peasants even began taking the long way around, sneaking through forests and marshes like fugitives, all to avoid paying a fee for using the earth. Thus, the walking tax became the perfect medieval innovation, turning basic survival into an invoice, because in the Middle Ages even gravity reported to the nobility. Fishing was once the last refuge of the medieval peasant. The river didn't ask questions. It didn't judge their smell. It didn't care about their social class. It simply existed, full of fish who were probably also wondering why humans were always crying nearby. For generations, peasants wandered down to the water, tossed in a crude net, and hoped to catch something other than boots, rocks, or existential despair. In the end, the bridge became a perfect medieval metaphor. Flimsy, overpriced, barely functional, and somehow still profitable for the only person who didn't use it. Medieval peasants lived simple lives held together by three basic actions: grinding grain, baking bread, and brewing beer. These weren't hobbies. These were survival skills. The holy trinity of, please don't let me die this winter. For generations, peasants handled all three tasks themselves, using tools fashioned from stones, wood, and sheer desperation. Everything worked fine, which made it inevitable that someone of noble birth would ruin the entire system. The trouble began when a baron, burdened with free time and a complete lack of empathy, realized peasants were performing essential life functions without consulting him first. He watched them grind grain, bake bread, and brew beer, and instead of thinking, how industrious, he thought, how dare they? His solution was simple: turn each basic survival task into a taxable event. First came the milling monopoly, which forced peasants to grind their grain at the Lord's mill, operated with all the grace of a collapsing wagon. Then came the oven tax, transforming communal baking into a bureaucratic ritual overseen by a man who didn't know the difference between flour and dust. And finally came the ale regulations, which required permission to brew the only beverage safe to drink without preparing your will. Each process became a miniature nightmare. A villager trying to grind grain had to trudge to the Lord's mill, wait in line, lose a portion of their flour to spillage, and pay a fee large enough to question whether bread was emotionally worth it. Baking required navigating the whims of the oven keeper, who acted like he was guarding the gates of heaven rather than a glorified fire pit. Brewing beer demanded an audience with the ale inspector, a man whose sole qualification was his ability to drink suspicious amounts of questionable liquid. Officers shouted orders above the screams and crackling flames, horns signaled movements between alleys, and ballista crews repositioned themselves wherever they could find a clear line of sight into the deeper parts of the city. Even in the thick of the smoke, the legions bore emblem, etched onto soot-blackened shields, moved steadily forward. Jerusalem fought back with the desperation of a cornered animal. Rebels launched ambushes from tunnels, archers rained down arrows from temple walls, and groups of defenders hurled stones from rooftops until Roman troops stormed the stairs and cleared them. The city's sacred geography, its temples, marketplaces, and holy courtyards, became the scenes of bitter, close-quarters combat. But Legio X possessed something the rebels lacked: an unwavering belief in their inevitable victory. Rome did not retreat from cities. It consumed them, with each street secured, each barricade crushed, and each fire swallowing another pocket of resistance. Legio X advanced relentlessly toward the heart of Jerusalem. The labyrinth was ablaze, and the legion was the flame cutting through it. As Legio X Fretensis fought its way deeper into Jerusalem, all roads, burning, ruined, and blood-soaked, converged on a single point: the temple. The defenders viewed the temple not merely as a fortress, but as the spiritual heart of their world, the last anchor holding their morale intact. If the temple fell, the revolt would crumble with it. If it stood, Rome's victory would remain incomplete. This made the ensuing phase of the battle unavoidable, a clash not just for a building, but for the very soul of a people. Titus, recognizing the symbolic impact of this confrontation, initially sought to preserve the temple. A destroyed holy site would serve as a lasting monument to resentment, while a captured one would stand as proof of Roman dominance. These markets weren't peaceful places. They were battlegrounds of shouting merchants, clashing interests, and endless competition. Without order, they would have descended into chaos. With guilds, they became controlled ecosystems, carefully managed, strategically regulated, and fiercely protected. Guilds didn't simply participate in markets. They dominated them. They claimed exclusive rights to produce and sell specific goods within the town walls. Bakers sold bread only if they belonged to the Bakers' Guild. Blacksmiths forged tools only with guild approval, and butchers cut meat under guild supervision. Even barbers, who acted half as haircutters and half as surgeons, operated within guild structures. If a craft existed, a guild eventually claimed it. This created monopolies that were both a blessing and a curse. For customers, a guild monopoly meant stable quality, predictable prices, and fewer dangerous surprises. Nobody wanted a badly shod horse, a weak beam in a home, or a physician who learned his trade by experimenting. Guild control kept disasters at bay. But monopolies also meant protectionism. Guilds guarded their privileges like dragons guarding treasure. No outsider, no matter how skilled, could set up a workshop without approval. Foreign merchants could sell goods only on certain days in certain zones under strict supervision. If a wandering tinker dared to repair pans inside city limits without permission, guild officers seized his tools and marched him to court. This control extended to the layout of towns. Guilds influenced where shops were placed, how stalls were arranged, and which crafts clustered together. Some streets became permanently associated with specific trades: the goldsmith's lane, the butcher's row, the shoemaker's quarter. These weren't just convenient arrangements. They were strategic centers of power. Guild members patrolled markets, checked weights and measures, enforced fair practice, and reported violations. The second challenge came from technology. Innovations in weaving, metallurgy, and mechanics emerged across Europe. However, guilds, protective of their methods, often resisted new tools that threatened the established order. A loom that enabled one man to work faster? Suspicious. A new brewing technique? Potentially dangerous. A better way to tan leather? Probably banned. Innovation existed, but guilds attempted to control it so tightly that progress slowed. Then came political shifts. Kings strengthened centralized governments and grew unwilling to share authority with independent urban guilds. Monarchs sided with merchants, granting trade privileges and licensing new industries without guild approval. Some rulers even dissolved guild power in certain trades, arguing that economic growth demanded freedom, not regulation. But the most transformative force was the early rise of capitalism. Wealthy merchants, no longer mere traders but investors, began financing large-scale operations: cloth halls, metal workshops, banking houses, and mining ventures. These enterprises required free labor, not guild restrictions. They employed workers directly, bypassing guild hierarchies entirely. Wages replaced master-apprentice bonds, and production scaled beyond what traditional shops could match. As the 15th century approached, guilds found themselves increasingly sidelined. They still wielded influence, still trained craftsmen, and still organized festivals, but they no longer controlled economic life. The world had grown too large, too fast, and too interconnected for their old rules. Yet their legacy endured. The apprenticeship model persisted into modern trades. Standards for quality and consumer protection can trace their roots to guild regulations. Even modern labor unions resemble the journeyman brotherhoods that defied masters centuries earlier. The guilds did not vanish. They transformed. Critics accused her of destabilizing the succession, manipulating Sullivan, and contributing to the empire's internal rivalries. Supporters, on the other hand, hailed her as a genius of statecraft, an outsider who had mastered the intricacies of the world's most formidable court and reshaped it with intelligence, loyalty, and strategic brilliance. Both perspectives hold a degree of truth. Herm's power undoubtedly protected her family, but it also irrevocably altered the empire's political landscape. In the final analysis, her story reveals the inherent paradox of her life. She was a slave who rose to become a queen, a foreigner who became the beating heart of the empire, and a woman who transformed private influence into public power. Her rise defied tradition, her strategies revolutionized dynastic politics, and her legacy endured long after her voice fell silent. Hurrem Sultan did not simply live in history, she actively shaped it. Fish was free, not because the Lord allowed it, but because nobody had been imaginative enough yet to charge for animals with no property deeds. And then, one afternoon, a nobleman standing on a bridge got an idea so catastrophic that historians should list it as an official medieval disaster. He watched a peasant haul a wriggling trout from the water, and instead of feeling a human emotion like empathy or good for him, he felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to own the entire river. He declared, in the confident tone of a man who had never been contradicted by reality, "The fish are mine." The peasants stared back at him, stunned, trying to understand how someone could own creatures that lived underwater and had never heard of taxes. But the noble insisted. The river belonged to his land. Therefore, everything in it did, too. This included fish, frogs, reeds, and likely several confused eels. Fishing became a licensed activity. But medieval licenses weren't pieces of parchment. They were just verbal threats disguised as permissions. The Lord's bailiff patrolled the banks, waiting to catch someone illegally retrieving dinner. If you pulled up a fish without paying, it was considered theft, of course, of something that nature created, and you physically caught with your own hands. Punishments varied. Some peasants were fined. Others had their nets confiscated. A few were dragged before the Lord and lectured about respecting authority, which was arguably worse. If you were caught fishing more than once, the Lord might take your boat, your dignity, or, in extreme cases, your freedom. Because nothing says justice like imprisoning someone for catching a carp. The absurdity didn't stop there. Some lords charged seasonal fishing fees, claiming winter fish were more valuable. Others taxed by species, as if a pike understood its own market worth. Peasants soon realized they weren't paying for services. They were paying for permission to exist. Even attempting to perform these tasks at home became a crime. A woman caught brewing beer in her own kitchen was fined for unauthorized fermentation. A charge that sounds scientific, but was really just the Lord's way of saying, stop being resourceful. If someone baked bread secretly, smoke rising from their chimney was treated like a distress signal, except the only people arriving were tax collectors. Together, the triple tax system formed a perfect medieval trap. No milling, no grain. No baking, no bread. No beer, no life. And the Lord collected revenue at every stage. It was the original subscription model, except with more hunger, more surveillance, and significantly worse customer support. Medieval markets began as wholesome, chaotic gatherings where peasants shouted prices. Chickens escaped frequently, and nobody had any idea what sanitation meant. They were loud, messy, and filled with the aroma of unwashed bodies and vegetables that were technically edible. Best of all, they were free to enter. You could walk in, set up a cloth on the ground, and sell your onions with the confidence of a capitalist who owned absolutely nothing. Naturally, this could not continue. One day, a lord stood on his balcony, looked down at the lively marketplace, and felt a sharp personal pain, the pain of watching people trade goods without paying him first. Free enterprise on his dirt. Bold, dangerous, unacceptable. So he installed a market gate, hired a man whose job was to be permanently irritated, and announced that everyone entering the market now owed a stall fee. Overnight, every peasant selling turnips was transformed into a reluctant taxpayer. This was only the beginning, of course. Medieval fees multiplied faster than bed bugs in a monastery. First came the entrance fee, because walking into the market apparently required financial commitment. However, wars often defy the wishes of commanders, especially when fire, fear, and exhausted soldiers mix within a city already half consumed by flames. Legio X advanced along the eastern approaches, pushing through barricades constructed from overturned carts, smashed furniture, and broken columns. The defenders fought with renewed ferocity. This was no longer about territory. It was about the survival of their identity. Every rebel who charged forward knew he was buying mere minutes for the temple behind him. The legions bore their emblazoned shields forward regardless. As fighting intensified around the outer courts, flames from nearby structures licked dangerously close. Arrows whistled overhead, and stones crashed down from above. Roman soldiers hacked through doorways and splintered gates, clearing rooms and corridors one by one. It was a brutal, suffocating struggle, with no grand formations or open-field tactics, just the grinding push of shields and blades in sacred halls. Somewhere in the chaos, a spark ignited where it shouldn't have. Ancient wood, dried by the summer heat, caught fire. The flames jumped from beam to beam, accelerated by wind, debris, and terror. In moments, fire raced up pillars and across ceilings. The defenders cried out for water. The Romans pleaded for order, but the blaze was beyond control. Legio X attempted to contain it, but war cares nothing for preservation. As the fire roared higher, rebels launched attacks with wild abandon, desperately trying both to repel the Romans and save the temple. The legionaries fought them off step by step until collapsing floors and choking smoke made the outcome inevitable. The temple burned, a sacred symbol turned to ash, its collapse echoing across the hills like a final, shattering truth. Jerusalem's fate was sealed. Legio X Fretensis had witnessed the death of a civilization's heart. And yet, the battle was not over. They acted like economists, police, and local politicians wrapped into one. Their presence stabilized daily life, but also created friction. Markets became many states with their own laws, emergencies, and politics. Tensions rose whenever supply shortages hit, prices spiked, customers complained, and guilds scrambled to regulate production. Yet overall, guild monopolies turned cities into highly organized commercial engines, predictable, prosperous, and safe enough for trade to flourish. But behind this order lurked conflict. As guilds tightened their grip, other groups, merchants, nobles, and even kings, began asking a dangerous question. Should guilds really have this much power? If guilds were only economic machines, their rise would have been impressive but short-lived. What made them so resilient, so deeply woven into medieval life, was the fact that they functioned as communities, almost like families bound not by blood, but by craft, pride, and ritual. To be part of a guild was to belong to something larger than oneself, something that shaped a man's identity from the day he entered as a trembling apprentice to the day he was carried to his grave. Every guild had its own rituals, feasts, symbols, and patron saints. Bakers honored Saint Honoratus, masons worshipped under the protection of the Virgin Mary, and goldsmiths revered Saint Eligius. These weren't decorative details, they were emotional anchors. In a world defined by uncertainty, famine, plague, war, fire, guild rituals offered structure and spiritual reassurance. When a guild gathered at its altar for mass, members didn't see rivals or competitors. They saw brothers of the same craft. Guild feasts were legendary, funded by membership dues and fines. Tables groaned under roasted meats, spiced breads, and barrels of ale. These celebrations weren't simply excuses to drink. They reinforced hierarchy. Masters sat at the high table, journeymen in the middle, and apprentices at the edges. What began as medieval brotherhoods left behind a blueprint for professional identity, collective bargaining, craftsmanship, and community that continues to resonate throughout the working world today. She entered history not as a princess or noble woman, but as a nameless girl dragged across the cold plains of Ruthenia. Born around 1502, somewhere in the lands controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, she grew up in a world marked by border raids, shifting alliances, and the constant threat of Tatar slavers. One of those raids changed her life forever. Taken prisoner as a young teenager, she was forced south along the slave routes that fed the markets of Crimea, a pipeline of human lives destined for the Ottoman Empire. Most disappeared into anonymity, but Roxolana did not. When she arrived in Istanbul, she was not led into a dungeon, but into a palace so vast it might as well have been its own world, the Topkapi Palace. There, behind towering walls and guarded gates, lay the imperial harem, a society within a society, a political machine disguised as a residence for women. Outsiders imagined it as a place of luxury. Insiders knew it as a battlefield of hierarchy, education, discipline, and intrigue. Every girl was trained to serve, to obey, and to survive. Few ever rose above the lowest ranks. Roxolana's arrival was unremarkable on the surface. A foreign captive, red-haired, and sharp-eyed, she entered at the very bottom. But the women around her quickly noticed there was something unusual about her. She was cheerful, strangely, defiantly cheerful. Where others bowed their heads, she met gazes. Where others spoke softly, she spoke with a spark that bordered on audacity. And beneath her bright demeanor was a razor-sharp mind, absorbing languages, etiquette, music, poetry, and the unspoken politics of palace life. To survive the harem, a girl needed discipline. To rise, she needed brilliance. Roxolana possessed both and something more dangerous: ambition. One particularly ambitious noble even attempted to tax fish caught by accident, such as those that leapt directly into buckets during storms. Thus, the river, formerly a source of life, became a medieval supermarket where the prices were high, the surveillance was constant, and the fish absolutely did not agree to any of this. Rain was one of the few dependable blessings in the medieval world. It fell from the sky without charging interest. It watered crops, refilled rivers, and gave peasants something to complain about that wasn't hunger, plague, or feudalism. Best of all, it was free, which, in medieval Europe, meant it was living on borrowed time. The trouble began when a particularly entrepreneurial lord looked out his manor window during a storm, noticed the peasants' roofs glistening with fresh rainwater, and felt a deep, unnatural anger that nature had dared to supply hydration without consulting him first. In his mind, water falling on his land was exactly the same as water belonging to him personally. So he announced a new rule with the confidence of a man who had never understood physics. All rain that touches my estate is mine. The peasants, drenched and confused, tried to wrap their heads around this revelation. The sky, to their knowledge, was not part of the lord's estate. It did not pay rent. It did not attend feudal ceremonies. It simply existed above everyone, aggressively neutral. But the lord was unmoved. If rain touched your bucket, your barrel, your roof, or your head, you were expected to pay a small fee for unauthorized water collection. In other words, water falling onto your face was now technically a crime. Peasants tried to argue. They pointed at the clouds, at the open sky, at the fact that water was not a sentient employee of the Lord, but medieval logic was a one-way street. The Lord insisted the clouds drifted over his land. Therefore, they were cooperating with him. Then came the space fee because your 1 square meter of dirt was suddenly premium real estate. Then came the merchant fee for the Lord's generous act of letting you breathe his air while selling your produce. The Lord had successfully monetized existence. The peasants adapted as best they could. Some squeezed 3 families' goods onto a single cloth to save money, creating a shopping experience so cramped it resembled a medieval thrift store designed by someone who hated joy. Others attempted to enter the market early to avoid the collectors, only to discover that the collectors slept at the gate like dedicated trolls. The worst part was that the Lord offered no services in exchange. The ground was uneven, the stalls were crooked, the smell was catastrophic, and nobody felt safe. Bandits wandered the aisles like confused customers, stray dogs stole sausages directly from tables, and chickens launched escape attempts with surprising intelligence. Yet the fees kept rising. A few daring peasants attempted to form unofficial markets in nearby meadows, where trading was free and spirits were high. Naturally, the Lord shut these down immediately, declaring them illegal gatherings, medieval code for "you forgot to pay me." By the end of it all, medieval markets transformed from simple communal gatherings into early prototypes of shopping malls. Crowded, overpriced, and controlled entirely by someone who never shopped there. By the end of the Middle Ages, one truth had become painfully obvious. Nothing remained free for long. If something brought comfort, relief, or the faintest glimmer of joy to peasants, it was merely a matter of time before a nobleman appeared, holding a scroll and a smirk, ready to slap a fee on it with the enthusiasm of a man who had never worked a day in his life. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping infestation of ownership, a word medieval lords applied liberally to anything they could physically stand near. With the temple reduced to a smoldering skeleton and Jerusalem gasping under layers of ash, Legio Exvertensis found itself in the final, most stubborn phase of the campaign, hunting down the pockets of resistance that refused to surrender. The destruction of the city's heart had shattered the revolt's unity, but not the determination of its survivors. Many defenders retreated into fortified quarters, underground passages, and hidden chambers, anywhere they could make a last stand. For the Legion, this meant the siege had transformed into a manhunt. The nature of the fighting shifted. Gone were the mass charges and open clashes. Instead, Legio X entered a warren of debris, shattered columns, collapsed roofs, and cramped tunnels. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, every corner another ambush. These surviving rebels fought with nothing left to lose. Some hurled themselves at Roman shields with makeshift weapons. Others set traps or launched sudden attacks from piles of rubble. It was unpredictable, exhausting work, an urban jungle of smoke and stone. But if there was one thing Legio X excelled at, it was systematic destruction. They moved through the ruins like a cold tide, clearing block by block. Engineers collapsed tunnels, sealed hidden rooms, and broke through walls to expose fighters inside. Scouts mapped remaining strongholds. Artillery crews fired short-range shots to pulverize stubborn pockets, and infantrymen, grim, soot-blackened, and relentless, pressed forward with the quiet certainty of men who knew this was the final act. The rebels clustered especially around the upper city, the last major bastion of organized resistance, a district of wealthy homes, massive stones, and strong defenses. But that only delayed the inevitable. Legio X approached with both discipline and brutality. Every toast, every blessing, every performance of a guild song reminded members that they belonged to a structured, honorable lineage. Charity formed a crucial part of guild identity. Members paid into funds that supported widows, the sick, the disabled, or craftsmen down on their luck. If a workshop, here is the translation of the provided text into American English, rewritten in an interpretive and slightly expanded style. The imperial harem was ruled by strict order, with ranks leading from servant to concubine, from concubine to favorite, and only in the rarest of cases from favorite to mother of a prince. The path was narrow and often deadly. Rivalries festered, alliances shifted overnight, and every smile could conceal a dagger. Yet, Roxolana adapted with unnatural speed. She earned trust, learned the palace rhythms, and observed the women who held influence. Slowly, the currents began to shift around her. She had arrived as a slave, but even then, before she ever met Suleiman, she was already stepping onto a path that would overturn centuries of Ottoman tradition. She had entered the palace a captive, but she would not remain one for long. For most women in the imperial harem, life revolved around discipline, obedience, and invisibility. The greatest talent a concubine could possess was quiet perfection, moving gracefully, serving flawlessly, and never drawing unwanted attention. But Hurrem, still known to many as Roxolana, seemed born to disrupt that world. She smiled too much, she laughed too freely, and she spoke with a brightness that unsettled the calculated stillness of palace life. And eventually, this very uniqueness pushed her into the orbit of the one man no concubine dared dream of capturing, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. When Suleiman first summoned her, it should have been a moment of terror. A sultan chose a girl often once, occasionally twice, rarely thrice, before moving on. The encounter could elevate her for a night, but meant little for the future. But Hurrem behaved unlike anyone he had ever summoned. Instead of trembling speechlessness, she greeted him with a kind of bold joy, equal parts innocence and wit. Rather than treating the sultan as a distant sovereign, she treated him as a man who could be spoken to, teased, and engaged with directly. Suleiman, a ruler hardened by campaigns and heavy responsibilities, was disarmed. This was, of course, nonsense, but nonsense is powerful when backed by armed men. People tried collecting rainwater secretly. They hid barrels behind houses. They placed buckets under eaves in the dead of night. They cupped their hands discreetly during storms. But the Lord's guards were relentless, patrolling during rainfall with the same energy modern security uses to chase teenagers out of malls. Some peasants were fined for hoarding moisture. One woman was accused of stealing atmospheric resources. A man was charged after being caught running outside with a bucket during a drizzle. His crime described formally as attempted precipitation theft. In the end, even the weather wasn't free in medieval Europe. Rain itself became part of the feudal economy, a perfect symbol of an age where nature belonged to whoever shouted "mine" the loudest while holding a sword. Grass was the one medieval resource that nobody thought to monetize. It grew everywhere, required zero effort, and tasted like disappointment, which made it perfect for cows, goats, sheep, and occasionally desperate peasants during famine. Animals wandered freely across the commons, nibbling as nature intended, blissfully unaware of the economic nightmare about to be created on their behalf. Everything changed the day a nobleman rode past the fields and noticed something terrifying. Peasant livestock grazing for free. His mind, naturally unburdened by morality or agricultural knowledge, began to panic. Free grazing meant free animals. Free animals meant wealth for peasants. And wealth for peasants meant they might start asking questions like, "Why are we starving while you have 12 kitchens?" This could not be allowed. So he invented grazing rights, a term that sounded official but was really just a fancy way of saying, "I'm charging you for the grass that literally grows out of the ground by itself." The announcement was delivered with theatrical gravitas. Bread ovens, rivers, forests, grass, bridges, beer, markets, marriages, all once free, all eventually converted into revenue streams for people whose job descriptions were essentially be wealthy. At first, peasants resisted, quietly, of course, because the Middle Ages weren't known for their tolerance of public-spirited debate. They whispered complaints, rolled their eyes behind haystacks, and invented surprisingly creative insults involving goats. But resistance was futile. Lords discovered early on that peasants needed things, and if peasants needed things, they could be charged for them. In fact, they should be charged for them. It was practically a divine obligation. By the final centuries of medieval life, the logic had become tragically circular. If something existed, it belonged to the Lord. If it didn't belong to the Lord, he claimed it. If he claimed it, he charged for it. If peasants objected, he fined them for objecting. The system fed itself like a snake made entirely of taxes. Even absurdity had limits, but medieval Europe consistently found new ones. One noble claimed ownership of the local sunrise because it appears over my land. Another attempted to tax shadows cast by buildings. A third proposed charging peasants for the privilege of using the road outside their own homes. That one didn't catch on, but only because the collectors couldn't figure out how to invoice sunlight. Eventually, peasants accepted their fate with the weary resignation of people who had been chronically disappointed by life since birth. They lived, worked, suffered, paid, and prayed that the next generation might be charged slightly less aggressively for breathing. Little did they know that the future would invent parking meters, subscription fees, and airline baggage charges, proof that while the Middle Ages eventually ended, the mindset behind medieval taxation absolutely did not. They fought up staircases slick with dust and blood, advanced across rooftops held by archers, and battered down gates reinforced with furniture, beams, and anything the defenders could scavenge. Slowly, the last pockets broke. Some rebels surrendered, starved, exhausted, and hollow-eyed. Others fought to their last breath, refusing to let the Romans take them alive. Legio X recorded no triumph in these final kills. It was simply work, grim and necessary. The city that had once defied them was now a carcass of fallen walls, burnt sanctuaries, and silent streets. By the time the upper city collapsed, resistance in Jerusalem was effectively dead. The revolt had been severed at every limb, every artery cut, and Legio X Fretensis, its shield scorched and its boar emblem blackened by smoke, stood as one of the primary executioners of Rome's will. The siege was over, but their role in Judea, and the legend that followed, was far from finished. With Jerusalem crushed and the revolt shattered, most legions would have marched home or been redeployed elsewhere. But Legio X Fretensis wasn't done with Judea, not by a long shot. Rome needed a permanent reminder for the region, something more persuasive than taxes and governors. A physical embodiment of fear, discipline, and consequence. And so, the emperor chose the perfect instrument, the same legion that had broken the rebellion. Legio X would remain in Judea as its iron shadow. Their new headquarters were established at Jerusalem itself, or what was left of it. The city, now a ruin of blackened stones and skeletal structures, had lost its role as a cultural and religious center. For Legio X, this ruin was not a tragedy. It was a fortress. They settled on the western hill, building barracks, workshops, granaries, and walls over the remains. Roman camps were not temporary. They were organisms that grew, hardened, and transformed landscapes. Soon, the boar insignia flew over ground that had once been sacred. Their exchange did not follow the script the court expected. She asked questions. She smiled as though she had no understanding of the centuries of protocol, saying she should not. In a place where even a tone of voice could be scrutinized for disrespect, Hurrem leaned into her natural charm without hesitation, and it worked. Suleiman left that first meeting unsettled, intrigued, and above all, eager to see her again. And he did. Night after night he summoned her, and night after night, she met him with the same mixture of fearless conversation, warmth, and intelligence. Soon, she was no longer merely a concubine. She became a favorite, and favorites held a dangerous, potent kind of influence. The harem noticed. Whispered envy turned into sharpened hostility. Other women who had spent years cultivating perfection now watched this foreign girl ascend with impossible speed. Yet Hurrem seemed untouched by fear. She understood the unspoken truth. Capturing a sultan's heart was the strongest shield in the empire. And Suleiman, a poet and philosopher as much as a conqueror, found in her not just beauty, but a mind capable of matching his own. What began as a single night grew into a partnership. What began as a summons grew into devotion. Hurrem had achieved the unthinkable. She made the sultan fall in love. In the Ottoman world, a concubine's power did not derive from beauty or wit. It came from bearing a son. A prince was the greatest currency a woman could offer, the only guarantee that she would not be cast aside when the sultan's attention shifted. Hurrem understood this perfectly, and when she gave birth to her first son, Mehmed, everything changed. She had crossed the threshold from favorite to mother of a Saitzad, a prince. That title alone elevated her above most of the harem, but she didn't stop there. Over the following years, Hurrem bore multiple children, sons and daughters, something unprecedented. The Baron declared that all grass, whether standing, partially chewed, or entirely theoretical, belonged exclusively to him. If a cow looked at grass on his land, that was trespassing. If a goat walked near grass, that was attempted theft. If a sheep even thought about grass, the Lord considered that conspiracy. Suddenly, the commons, land historically shared by the entire village, became a legal minefield. Cows could no longer wander. Goats could no longer roam. Shepherds had to escort their animals like overworked security guards, constantly scanning the horizon for the Baron's tax collectors, lurking behind shrubs like medieval paparazzi. Some peasants attempted diplomacy. "My lord," they explained, "this grass has always been free, and that, more than anything, is the real legacy of medieval Europe. Everything was free until one idiot charged everyone, and humanity has been paying ever since." Legio X Fretensis did not emerge from the calm, orderly machine people imagine when they hear Roman Legion. No, its birth was violent, messy, and soaked in the saltwater spray that gave the legion its famous name. Fretensis meant of the Strait, a nod to the Strait of Messina, where the earliest soldiers of the unit first proved they could fight on land, sea, and anywhere in between. From its first days, Legio X Fretensis was shaped not by parade grounds and marble cities, but by storms, blades, and the chaotic geography of the Mediterranean world. Their presence changed the rhythm of Judea entirely. Patrols marched the roads daily, watchtowers sprang up along major routes, and checkpoints monitored movement between towns. Rebellious settlements were scrutinized, peaceful ones were taxed and surveyed. The legion became the backbone of Roman control, a constant reminder that resistance was not merely futile, but suicidal. and Legio X handled the job with the cold efficiency Rome expected. They put down minor uprisings quickly and decisively, escorted officials, guarded supply caravans, enforced laws, and built infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, and fortified posts spread outward, all bearing the unmistakable stamp of Roman engineering. Even people who had never seen a Roman soldier could feel their influence in the stone beneath their feet. Ottoman tradition maintained that once a concubine bore a son, she was sent to the prince's provincial court, never again to share the sultan's bed. This prevented women from accumulating too much influence, kept power balanced, and preserved the ancient rotational system. Suleiman shattered that system for her. He kept Hurrem at the palace, continued visiting her, and they had more children: Selim, Bayezid, Sahanger, and Maraima, the daughter who would become her closest political ally. With every birth, Hurrem's position strengthened, but so did the danger. The Ottoman succession system was brutal. Sons of different mothers competed for the throne, and mothers, in turn, competed for survival. A prince's loss meant death, exile, or strangulation, fates that often swept away his mother as well. Hurrem was surrounded by rivals. Chief among them was Mahidevran, the mother of Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa. Mustafa was popular, charismatic, the heir apparent, and his mother believed her path to power was guaranteed. Hurrem threatened everything. Their rivalry was more than personal. It was existential. Within the palace walls, alliances formed and dissolved like storm clouds. Eunuchs, tutors, concubines, and advisors each chose sides. Every gesture, every rumor, every glance carried political weight, and survival depended on strategy. Hurrem's intelligence became her armor. She built networks among the palace servants, befriended scholars, charmed foreign ambassadors, and cultivated a reputation for piety and charity. She positioned herself as both mother and moral guardian. The public began to see her not as a concubine but as a dignified figure, a presence with purpose. Inside the harem, however, she was a tactician. She knew the greatest threat to her children was Mustafa, and therefore Mahidevran. The contest for influence intensified, setting the stage for the most turbulent relationships of Suleiman's reign. Hurrem had risen from slave to mother of multiple princes, but in the empire of the Ottomans, motherhood was only the beginning. The true battle was for the future itself. As Hurrem's influence grew, so did the fury of her enemies. Her unprecedented rise broke centuries of custom and threatened the delicate balance of power inside the palace. No rivalry embodied this more fiercely than her conflict with Mahidevran, the mother of Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa. Their feud was not a petty disagreement between women. It was a collision of dynastic futures. Mahidevran had once been Suleiman's favored companion. She occupied the position Hurrem now held, and she believed herself destined to become the mother of the next sultan. Mustafa was strong, admired, and deeply respected by the army, especially the Janissaries. To many, his future throne seemed guaranteed, but Hurrem's arrival destabilized everything. With every new child she bore, with every audience she gained, with every whisper that reached Suleiman's ear, Mustafa's inevitable rise seemed less certain. The harem braced itself for a storm. The famous confrontation between Hurrem and Mahidevran, where Mahidevran allegedly attacked her in a fit of rage, was more than a personal conflict. It became a symbolic moment. Hurrem emerged wounded but victorious. Suleiman, enraged by the assault, distanced himself from Mahidevran forever. From that moment onward, Hurrem's ascent accelerated. But Hurrem was no fool. She knew a wounded rival was more dangerous than a confident one. Mahidevran still had Mustafa, and Mustafa had the loyalty of the military. To survive, Hurrem needed to strengthen her own support network. She began cultivating alliances beyond the harem walls, something women rarely achieved. She befriended the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha's rivals, corresponded with foreign diplomats, and won influence among scholars and jurists. She used charity as a political weapon, funding soup kitchens, mosques, and hospitals. Her generosity earned her a reputation for piety and compassion, a subtle counterweight to the poisonous rumors spread by her rivals. Yet Hurrem also understood psychology. She crafted letters that appealed to Suleiman's emotions, portraying herself as loyal, tender, and vulnerable. These letters, preserved today, reveal a woman who mastered the art of emotional diplomacy. But beneath the soft language was a strategist with clear objectives: protect her children, undermine Mustafa's faction, and reshape the palace's power hierarchy. Her moves were subtle, patient, and calculated. She played a long game, understanding that Suleiman's heart was her greatest shield, but also her greatest responsibility. The harem was no longer merely a residence. Under Hurrem's presence, it had become a political battlefield, and she was emerging as its undeniable commander. By the mid-16th century, Hurrem Sultan had already defied the expectations placed on any concubine. She had risen from foreign captive to mother of multiple princes, from palace outsider to Suleiman's closest companion. But the transformation that came next shattered an even deeper pillar of Ottoman political tradition, one that had stood unchallenged for centuries. Suleiman married her. To the outside world, this event was nothing short of revolutionary. Ottoman sultans did not take legal wives. Marriage tied a ruler to a single woman and her family, creating dynastic alliances that could weaken or constrain imperial authority. Concubinage, by contrast, ensured flexibility, prevented powerful marriage ties, and allowed the dynasty to continue without foreign influence. Every sultan before Suleiman had maintained this system. Suleiman broke it for Hurrem. The wedding was kept discreet inside the palace, but the shockwaves spread instantly. Istanbul buzzed with rumors. Why would the sultan formalize his relationship with a slave girl? What power had she wielded? Was it love, politics, magic? Even theories exploded across the empire. But one truth was undeniable. Hurrem was no longer merely the joyful one. She was the sultan's legal wife and entered history as Haseki Sultan, the highest-ranking woman in the empire. Marriage granted Hurrem unprecedented authority. Her influence over Suleiman, already strong, now became institutional. She acquired her own court, her own income, and her own political network. She began corresponding with foreign monarchs, letters that astonished diplomats with their clarity and confidence. She was treated as royalty, not concubine, as partner, not ornament. Her signature appeared on charitable foundations, legal documents, and orders for vast architectural projects. But her elevation also intensified the danger around her. The court's elite, viziers, advisors, harem leaders, and foreign ambassadors, watched her with suspicion. Traditionalists muttered that the empire was being reshaped by a woman's whims. Enemies whispered that she had bewitched Suleiman, twisting him away from ancient customs. Hurrem was fully aware of the risks. Legitimacy gave her protection but also visibility. Every decision she made, every alliance she forged, every whisper she uttered would be scrutinized. She responded with elegance and precision. She used the tools of royalty, charity, diplomacy, letters, and architecture to transform her public image from favorite concubine into queenly benefactor, building mosques, schools, public baths, and soup kitchens throughout Istanbul. The marriage marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. For the first time in Ottoman history, a woman stood beside the Sultan, not as shadow, but as partner. No moment in Hurrem Sultan's life is more infamous or more debated than the downfall of Prince Mustafa. It was the turning point that cemented her reputation as brilliant to some, ruthless to others. And whether she orchestrated it fully or simply influenced the course of events, one truth is clear: the stakes had never been higher.